Hi, I'm going to adjust this, this podium. I'm Shahidha Bari. I'm so delighted to see so many of you, and also mildly shocked. What are you doing here on a Friday night? It's delightful to have you here. I know why you're here, because this is a topic that is piercing us, I think. This is a set of questions that is penetrating so much of our personal and our cultural lives, and it is asking foundational questions about works that we love, institutions that we cherish, how they are structured, and how we understand all of those things. So I know why you're here. Those questions are important. I'm going to be talking fairly informally, so I hope you'll forgive me. I've got two major points that I want to make, and then a small constellation of other insights, observations perhaps, that I'm going to offer too. But I want to preface it by a kind of top line. I always think that the question, this isn't quite the question we're asking here. The question we're asking here is, can we still love the work of celebrated writers? I think the answer to that question is very easy, and that is yes. But the other formulation of that question is sometimes, can we separate the work from the life? And I always find that question an intolerably dull one, it seems to me. It seems to me the wrong question. And I'm going to pose a set of different questions, perhaps, that come at this subject. And I want to preface my comments with a top line, as it were. This is what I want to say to you. Perhaps this is my question. Why be a troubled genius when you can be a kind and generous one? Why be a troubled genius when you could be a kind and generous one? And that's where my reflections are going to head towards. So the conversations we're having at the moment about work and life, or the work of the brilliant work of bad men is one efficient way of putting it. Those are really important questions. They're reparative conversations we're having at the moment. They're reassessments, necessary ones, overdue ones, and they are transforming the way that museums and galleries are structured and the ways that we present work, what we show, how we show it, how we contextualize it. I want to invite you also to reflect on the culture that comes of these kinds of conversations and what it takes to create an inclusive arts culture, because I think all of those questions feed into that larger question. But I think we're not always having the right conversations. The question about whether we can separate the good art from the bad man seems to me a very bald and stark one, a wrong-headed one, and it overlooks something about the nature of aesthetic experience. So this is my first major insight, and it's a very basic insight in many ways, which is that we don't always have a choice about the work we love, admire, respond to, or find ourselves provoked by. And any of you who have been felled by a Caravaggio in this museum, or have heard a piece of music that has pierced you to your core, know this, that we don't always have a choice about the ways that we respond to the works that move us and that provoke us. And this isn't just to say that art is somehow mystical and sacred, but it is to say that our attachments and our immersion can be deep. The example I use sometimes is the one about Eric Gill. Everybody knows that Eric Gill was an unspeakably wicked man. And I work at the BBC often, so I walk in under that statue of Ariel. I've been working at a university which I've just left for the last 10 years. I've been giving lectures in a theatre that has, I hadn't realised until the very last year. I looked up from my lecture, and there is a bas relief that surrounds the hall in Gill's familiar hand, wrapped around this university building that I've been working in for the last 10 years. What I mean to say by that is no matter how much we despise someone's moral character, we are often much closer to them than we might like, and sometimes their work is hiding in plain sight. I can despise Gill, but what does it mean for my thoughts to take the shape of his letters? What I'm trying to suggest here is that influence is subtle and deep, and we are not always in a position to make choices about how we interact with them and how our responses are entangled in them. Philosophers feel this very deeply, I think. I work in philosophy too, like like Sasha and Daniel, the influence that a thinker has can be subtle and penetrating. So, for instance, it is impossible to write and think in the tradition of continental philosophy as I do without a figure like Heidegger. He is like this faintest chemical trace in the water that we consume. You can despise his politics and regret his moral character, but there is no way that you can conduct business in philosophy or in contemporary continental philosophy without Heidegger too. So that's my basic observation, the first one. We don't always have a choice about the work we love, admire, or find ourselves entangled in. The second, also simple observation, is that it's not always so useful to think about what we do with the legacy of these writers and artists. Sometimes it seems to me more instructive to think about the choices that we do have. For instance, how do we open up the category of genius? How do we decouple it from those apparently necessary prefixes, the suffering genius, the troubled genius, the tortured genius? The image of the troubled artist is such a seductive trope. Sometimes being troubled feels like the index of genius, as though entitlement, immorality, impropriety, unkindness, even violence, those are the signal of an exceptional artistic character. And the upshot of our current hand-wringing about the ethical status of artists and their lives is that we are seeing curators and galleries being resourceful and thinking hard about what it means to be a genius and who qualifies as a genius. One of the things that I'm increasingly persuaded of in my experience as a cultural critic is that there are so many kinds of genius, many geniuses, that genius is not a slim and elite category. We are working really hard to uncover all sorts of genius, other kinds of geniuses, the geniuses that are languishing, undiscovered, very often women, very often not Western and not privileged. And this is why it seems to me important that a conversation like this one about the ethics of an artwork and an artist is this conversation, which is a reappraisal of artists and their legacies that comes in the wake of #MeToo, is also not detached from other movements like that of decolonizing the museum. And these are the smaller points I want to make. Do I have time?
Yes.
I do, okay. So I'll make these very, oh God, I feel like the countdown clock is running, but I'll do it. So the smaller points I want to make are, our concern is it shouldn't just be what these men have done in their lives, but also what these works present, what is in the works too. So the example I can give you, not from Gauguin or from visual culture, is literary. I'm working on a documentary at the moment about the Nobel novelist V.S. Naipaul. It's interesting, we're in the middle of a controversy about the latest Nobel Prize winners today, Peter Handke, but V.S. Naipaul won the Nobel Prize in 2001, and if he died last year, of course, too. And if any of you know his work, that if you know him and read his biography, he behaved in absolutely abominable ways. He treated the women in his life with extraordinary cruelty, it seems. And we can criticize that, but we can also criticize the work. The work diminishes the role of women. It articulates the most unhappy, bleak pictures of other nations. So our work is not just to think about the life of the people, but the way that their values or their perspectives are also represented in their work. And that is not to diminish the work, but to see it anew, to see it under a different light, not to fold away those books or to throw them off a shelf. Every time I've been interviewing people about this documentary, I ask them, do we throw those books off the shelf? Do we take Gauguin off the wall? And it seems to me obvious that we don't. Of course we don't. These works are enormously enriched by these critical perspectives. We see them anew, and their ambiguities make them even more profound, it seems to me. The second smaller point, the Naipaul case is very interesting to me, and I think we can think about artists too in the same vein, which is that I don't think any of us ever want to excuse the behaviours and the actions and the views of reprehensible people, and we have to be careful about a culture of apologism, apologising for unforgivable things. But human beings are formed by experiences, and one of the things that we do, I think, really well in our relationship to art is to understand the ways that human beings are shaped by their experiences. Experiences of colonialism, experiences of trauma. This is not to excuse the way that people present the world or the unsavory things they say, but it is to try to understand human behaviours in a broader context. And ironically, that is what art invites us always to do, I think. The last small point I was going to make is that I'm always very wary of the rebuke that we ought not to hold artists to the standards of our own time, that they are beholden, in fact, to the standards of a different time, which will be a very familiar refrain to those of you who've engaged in this conversation. And it seems to me that it is never sufficient to relativize a person's moral or immoral actions as a result of their standards, the standards of their times. And the thing I would say to you very simply is don't let it pass. Don't let it pass. The standards of the past were shit. We should keep challenging them. I mean, there's so much furious, incensed conversation at the moment about trigger warnings and woke students and oversensitive snowflakes. But the thing about that culture is that it's not about students or young people or the woke somehow protecting themselves against unhappy perspectives of the world. Rather, these are people encouraging us all to be newly alert to things that have been under-examined. Decolonizing the museum, #MeToo, all of these movements are not specifically about minority groups or about women. They are movements for all of us. They are not just for people of colour, and they are not just for women. It is a good for all of us to understand works in the context of those movements. And the last point I want to make is I was interviewing Rebecca Solnit recently, who's just written a book about the #MeToo movement, and she was saying that she thinks that what we're seeing is something new under the sun, something transformative is happening to our culture right now, this age of sexual reckoning, the impulse that is asking us to interrogate our relationship with age-old institutions and the artists that we love. This is something new under the sun, she says. And I want to believe that. I'm inspired by that. I'm motivated by seeing Extension Rebellion on our doorstep, by seeing an audience full of people like you here today. But I'm also very conscious that if you walk through any gallery in this city, in this country, the truth is that art endures. Art endures, and the misdemeanors of men, they are very easily forgotten. And that is our great challenge, I think. So I'll leave it there.